Camille Dorsey walked into that courtroom like any other public defender. Gray slacks, worn shoes, no makeup. Within 15 minutes, the arresting officer mocked her. The judge dismissed her, and no one realized they were humiliating the Attorney General of Virginia. What she did next? It changed everything. If silent power moves you, like this video, share it, and subscribe for more stories that echo where it matters most. The courtroom was colder than it should have been for a spring morning. The air conditioning hummed too loud, as if trying to muffle something more dangerous than heat. Camille Dorsey stepped through the double doors, her heels soft on the linoleum, the leather folder under her arm still warm from her grip. She didn't wear anything that said power. No pearls, no tailored jacket, no polished heels, just gray slacks, a plain black blouse, and her late father's courtroom watch ticking faintly at her wrist. It was 8:42 a.m., too. No one looked up. The bailiff at the entrance, a heavy-set white man with a buzz cut and too much pride stitched into his uniform, barely glanced at her before thrusting a file into her chest without so much as a hello. "You interns are getting younger every year," he muttered with a smirk. Camille said nothing. Not because she didn't know what to say, because she'd already decided it wasn't worth wasting words on someone who didn't know he was speaking to the most powerful legal official in the entire state. She tucked the file under her arm, took one breath, and walked forward. The courtroom was one of those old municipal chambers, the kind that hadn't changed in 30 years. Faded wood paneling, scuffed benches, fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead like tired bees. There were 10 people in the gallery, 2 reporters with laptops open, and 1 young man at the defense table. Devin Ellis, 22 years old, wrongfully arrested, and clearly terrified. Camille saw it in the way he didn't look up when she approached, the way his shoulders folded inward like the world was pressing down on him. Judge Byron Lasker sat high behind the bench, flipping slowly through a thick docket with the bored air of someone who stopped listening years ago. His glasses were perched at the end of his nose, more for effect than utility. He glanced at Camille over the rim of them, then down again without acknowledgement. Case number 436, People versus Devin Ellis. Representation by, let's see here, C. Dorsey, Lasker droned. Camille raised her hand politely. "Camille Dorsey, Your Honor." He didn't look up, didn't correct himself, just muttered flatly, "Proceed when ready, Miss Dorsey." No welcome, no formal recognition, no hint that he'd even read the line under her name that said, Office of the Attorney General. He couldn't be bothered. And that, Camille thought, was the point. Men like Judge Lasker didn't overlook things. They dismissed what they couldn't respect. She took her place at the defense table beside Devin. He looked at her sideways, unsure. She leaned over, voice low. "We're going to fix this. Just sit tight." Devin blinked, like he couldn't believe someone in the room was speaking to him with calm. Across the aisle, seated with exaggerated confidence, was the arresting officer, Detective Sean Braddock. Late 40s, square jaw, closely cropped beard, arms folded like he was waiting to be congratulated. His leg bounced. He locked eyes with Camille, gave a small chuckle, then shook his head like he knew something she didn't. She turned away. This was not her first courtroom. She had stood in federal courts, addressed governors, briefed judges far more powerful than Byron Lasker. But never had she entered a room where the temperature dropped simply because a black woman walked in wearing plain clothes and carried the truth. A voice behind her coughed. A clerk. Papers shuffled. A reporter typed. But no one, not one person, bothered to acknowledge that Camille Dorsey was not an intern, not a law student, not a hopeful assistant. She was the Attorney General of Virginia, a title she had earned not through legacy, but through war. Every step of her career had been uphill. Every Miss Dorsey, a reduction of who she was. Every courtroom like this one, where silence wasn't neutrality, it was conspiracy. She looked at Judge Lasker. He was already motioning toward the prosecution table. "We'll begin with opening statements," he said, without ever offering her the floor. Camille stood, quietly. No fanfare, no throat-clearing, just presence. She placed her leather folder on the table and opened it with a slow, practiced hand. Every movement was deliberate. Every second of calm was chosen, not gifted. The bailiff watched from the side, eyes narrowed now. There was something about her stillness he couldn't place. A courtroom thrives on noise, objections, shouts, gavel slams. But Camille brought silence that suffocated arrogance. It unnerved people used to shouting to win. She stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said, clearly but without raising her voice, "before we proceed, I respectfully request the court acknowledge a procedural irregularity in the arrest and detainment of Mr. Ellis." Detective Braddock scoffed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Here we go," he said under his breath, though loud enough for the gallery. Lasker didn't rebuke him. Camille didn't blink. "Mr. Ellis has been held without formal charge for 4 days. The arrest report references an outdated statute. My office—" "Let's save the speeches for trial, Counselor," Judge Lasker cut in, not even looking up. A few people in the gallery chuckled. Devon sank slightly in his seat. And Camille Dorsey, calm, composed, unshaken, closed her folder. Not because she was finished, because they were. No one in that room realized who she was. Not yet. But they would. And not because she raised her voice or threw down credentials. Because sometimes the loudest truth doesn't come in thunder. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wears gray slacks, and waits. 8 minutes in, and they'd already disrespected the one woman who had the legal power to dismantle the system they were hiding behind. And she would. Because Camille Dorsey wasn't just here to defend a college student. She was here to expose a courtroom that had forgotten what justice sounded like. It was about to remember. Camille Dorsey had stood in courtrooms before, but few like this one. Where the injustice didn't scream, it hummed beneath every breath, every smirk, every turned face. After Judge Lasker waved her off like a gnat, she returned to her seat beside Devon Ellis, the 22-year-old whose future now balanced on the edge of a lie. The lie hadn't just come from an error in the paperwork, it came from a culture. And in this courtroom, culture spoke louder than truth. Detective Sean Braddock leaned back in his chair at the prosecution table. One leg crossed over the other, arms folded. The posture of someone who believed the room belonged to him. His badge sat on his chest like a shield, polished and visible. And when Camille glanced his way, he didn't blink. He smiled. A slow, ugly thing. "You sure you're in the right room, sweetheart?" he called across the aisle, loud enough for the jurors to hear. Camille didn't look at him. Instead, she placed her pen gently on her notepad, smoothed a crease on the file the bailiff had shoved into her earlier, and waited. She didn't need to match his noise. She had already started collecting receipts. Braddock stood, slowly, like he was stretching out a show. He picked up a manila folder from the prosecution stack and took the scenic route around the tables. Too close. He brushed past Camille's chair like the floor was his runway, and with theatrical indifference, dropped the file in front of her with a loud smack. "Careful with that legal stuff," he said, feigning concern. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." Then he looked to the gallery, raised his brows, and added, "Ain't this something? We letting interns argue now?" A few jurors laughed. Not all of them, but enough. The kind of laugh that doesn't rise from humor but from permission. Permission to be cruel in a room where cruelty was wearing a uniform and smirking. Camille didn't flinch. She simply picked up the file, smoothed the corner where it had bent against her collarbone, and set it aside without even opening it. Her fingers remained still, her breath even. But something in the air shifted. "Sometimes, officer," she said, finally meeting his gaze, "the loudest man in the room is just trying to hide how little he knows." Braddock blinked. His grin twitched. The courtroom hushed. One of the jurors shifted in their seat. The clerk cleared her throat, quietly. The judge didn't say a word, still pretending not to notice, but the tension had thickened, like humidity before a storm. From the corner of the room, a woman who had been sweeping, small-framed, older, her headscarf tied neatly, paused her broom. Her name tag read G. Fields, but everyone called her Miss Gloria. She wasn't moving anymore. She was watching Camille now, head tilted, her eyes narrowed like someone looking at a memory that had just come to life. "That's Harold Dorsey's girl," she whispered to herself, almost inaudibly. "Lord, I'll be." Back at the table, Camille opened her leather folder and removed only what she needed. One page. She didn't announce it, didn't look up for dramatic effect. She simply laid it flat on the desk, like a playing card in a game she was already winning. Judge Lasker, still bored behind the bench, muttered, "Let's keep this moving, counselor. 5 minutes. Make it tight." Camille nodded once. "Tight enough to squeeze out the truth, Your Honor." She stood with purpose, not force, and turned to face the courtroom. The moment felt small, but somehow heavy, like gravity had increased around her. "The defense will show," she began calmly, "that Mr. Ellis was held for 4 days on a charge that legally could not justify more than 24 hours of detainment. The arrest was made under subsection 11F, which was repealed in 2018 and replaced with 12B, a statute that requires supervisor authorization for extended holding in nonviolent first-time offenses." She flipped a second page onto the desk. "And the supervisor's signature?" She looked at the judge. "Absent." Sean Braddock shifted in his seat. Camille continued, still poised, still quiet. "This court, under your authority, Your Honor, enacted the replacement statute on January 3, 2019. Your name is at the bottom of the policy order." This time Judge Lasker looked up. The jurors weren't chuckling anymore. One leaned forward, elbow on the rail. Another tucked their phone into a purse and folded their hands. Something was unraveling, and no one, not even Braddock, could stop it. Camille turned back toward Braddock, slowly. "You've served on this force for 12 years, she said, her tone even. "And yet, you cited a policy that's been dead for 7. Braddock opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Camille stepped closer. "You mocked my qualifications. You called me an intern. You threw a file at my chest like this was your playground. But the truth is," she paused, just enough for the words to land, "you fabricated a case and detained a young black man for nearly a week with no legal basis, no supervisory sign-off, and no intention to answer for it." A silence settled over the room, not quiet out of politeness, but still out of realization. Judge Lasker cleared his throat. "Let's proceed." Camille's eyes flicked toward him, but she said nothing. Instead, she returned to her seat. Miss Gloria in the corner leaned on her broom now, eyes glassy, voice low. "She got his fire," she whispered, "but she ain't got to shout to burn 'em." Braddock rubbed his jaw. He didn't look at her. His hands fidgeted with the edge of the prosecution's table. And for the first time that morning, the courtroom wasn't focused on his badge. It was watching Camille. Her stillness, her poise, the way she didn't need to raise her voice to shake the entire foundation of that room. She began her case not with fireworks, but with facts, with law, with composure sharpened by experience and decades of inherited pain. They thought she was small. They thought she didn't matter. They thought she'd fold. They were wrong, and that misjudgment, their dismissal of the quiet woman in plain clothes, was about to cost them everything. For a courtroom used to noise, raised voices, dramatic objections, quick gavels to shut them down, the silence that followed Camille Dorsey's words was a different kind of loud. It wasn't respect, not yet. It was something colder, something heavier. Recognition. She didn't yell, she didn't grandstand. She just said the truth, plainly and precisely. You cited subsection 11F, which was repealed in 2018. That one sentence, delivered with no more force than a turning page, cracked the floor under their certainty. Detective Sean Braddock, who had just moments ago strutted like the room belonged to him, now sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth might have cracked. He looked at Judge Byron Lasker, waiting, hoping for some kind of dismissal, a smirk, an interruption to save him. But the judge, for the first time that morning, didn't look bored. He looked alert and slightly off balance, like a man who suddenly remembered he'd signed something he hoped no one would ever bring up. Camille had made sure he would. She took her time now. No rush. Every movement was deliberate, as if she were unspooling a thread they couldn't untangle fast enough to stop her. She reached back into her folder and pulled out the document that replaced the repealed statute, subsection 12B, placing it softly on the evidence table. This court ratified the revised policy on January 3, 2019, she continued. Page 2 outlines that nonviolent first-time offenders may not be held beyond 24 hours without signed approval from a supervising officer. Mr. Ellis was held for 4 days. She paused, just long enough for the weight of the numbers to land. "Where is that signature, Detective Braddock?" The detective shifted in his seat, clearly searching for a response. It was, verbal approval. Camille didn't even need to interrupt him. She simply raised one eyebrow, calm and expectant. "Verbal?" she echoed, with the kind of disbelief that didn't need volume to cut. Now the jurors leaned in, not all of them at once, but enough to create a visible shift. One of them, an older man in a navy windbreaker, actually sat up straighter, arms unfolding as he stared at Braddock like he'd just realized he'd been handed a performance, not a report. Another, a young woman in a red sweater, closed her notebook softly and placed her pen down. She wasn't writing anymore. She was listening. Braddock cleared his throat. "That's how we've always done it. Sometimes things move fast in the field. And yet," Camille said, opening a third document, "according to internal departmental policy, updated in the same session this statute was passed, verbal authorizations must be followed by written confirmation within 24 hours. Is that your handwriting on this form, officer?" She slid the page forward on the screen. Blank. Braddock didn't answer. He didn't have to. A few people in the gallery murmured. The courtroom, which had opened its morning with casual cruelty and polite disregard, was now folding inward. Postures changed. Phones disappeared back into purses. Even the court clerk, who hadn't made eye contact with Camille all morning, glanced at her now, quickly, then away, like she wasn't sure what she was seeing. Judge Lasker leaned back, rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. He didn't say anything, but for the first time that day, he was no longer dismissing her. He was calculating. And that, Camille knew, was the beginning of the end. For him, for Braddock, for the culture they'd all gotten so comfortable swimming in. Miss Gloria, broom now forgotten, stood in the far left corner near the exit door. She hadn't moved in minutes. Her hands rested atop the broom handle, her knuckles pale against the wood. She wasn't sweeping anymore. She was bearing witness. And beneath her breath, no louder than the creak of the floorboards beneath her shoes, she whispered, "That girl got receipts." Camille stayed poised, centered. She didn't smile, didn't allow herself that moment of satisfaction, though it tempted her. Because this wasn't about being right. It was about being undeniable. She stepped away from the screen. "If the court's time is short," she said, with a glance toward Judge Lasker, "I can proceed directly to the timeline discrepancies in the jail intake records and the body cam footage, or would the prosecution prefer to explain the lack of legal documentation themselves?" Braddock opened his mouth, but nothing came out. That silence, the kind that follows exposure, hung in the room like smoke. No one was sure what they were supposed to do with it, but everyone felt it. "Let's proceed," Judge Lasker muttered, but even his voice had lost its bite. Camille returned to the defense table without a word, sat down, and flipped to the next page of her notes like this was just another Tuesday. But the room had changed. She had walked in as a shadow, and now every eye tracked her movements. No yelling, no theatrics, no threats. Just a woman, misjudged and dismissed, returning fire with facts and letting the truth do what it was always meant to do. Rise. Braddock sat hunched now, visibly sweating. He rubbed his jaw again, as if trying to loosen a tongue that had gotten tangled in its own lies. Across the aisle, a reporter adjusted his laptop screen, typing furiously. A headline had started to form. Attorney General? No, that can't be her. Can it? He didn't know yet. No one did. But something deep in the bones of the room told them all. They weren't watching a defense attorney anymore. They were watching a reckoning in slow motion. Judge Lasker cleared his throat once more. "Miss Dorsey, continue." She did. Not because she had to prove anything, but because they still didn't know who she was. And when they found out, the shift wouldn't just be in posture or tone. It would be in history. The air in the courtroom had changed. Not suddenly, not with a bang, but like the slow unwinding of a knot no one noticed until it tightened. Camille Dorsey had already done what none of them thought possible. She'd shifted the gravity of the room without raising her voice. She'd cracked their certainty with nothing but facts. Now, she sat quietly at the defense table, fingers lightly tracing the corner of a report that exposed more than Braddock had ever intended to reveal. The room had leaned in, but power hates being embarrassed. Detective Sean Braddock, red-faced and rigid, had been holding on to his temper by the thinnest of threads. And that thread snapped the moment Camille pointed out the blank authorization form. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was humiliating. He could feel it pressing down on him, could see the jurors shifting away from his side of the room, could hear the scribbling of the reporter in the back row. Even Judge Lasker's gaze, once dismissive, had grown evasive, as if he knew they were all sinking into something they could no longer deny. So Braddock did what men like him do when truth outpaces their authority. He got louder. He stood without being called, walked directly across the courtroom, shoulders stiff, footsteps deliberate. And with all the pent-up fury of a man watching his control slip, he slammed a thick file folder onto Camille's table. The sound cracked like a gavel against bone. Papers jolted. Pens jumped. Devon flinched. "Here!" Braddock snapped, voice just shy of a shout. "Maybe this'll help you catch up, counselor." The word was spit, not spoken. Sarcasm dressed in authority. Camille didn't look up right away. She simply adjusted the folder with 2 fingers, placed it beside her notes without opening it, and smoothed her blazer. Her movements weren't hurried. They were surgical, like someone preparing for a procedure she'd done 1,000 times. The courtroom froze. No one laughed this time. No one dared. A few rows back, Miss Gloria Fields stood motionless, one hand still resting on her broom, the other now pressed lightly against her chest. She wasn't the only one holding her breath. Camille finally looked up at Braddock. "Are you trying to scare me, officer?" she asked softly. Braddock gave a smirk, but it faltered on one corner. "Just trying to help. Some folks need extra support." Still, Judge Lasker said nothing. He adjusted his glasses, pretending to read something that wasn't there. The court clerk glanced toward the bench, then back to Camille. Even the bailiff, standing like a statue near the door, looked uncertain now, his eyes flicking between Braddock and the judge, unsure of where the invisible line had gone or if it had ever been there at all. And that was the moment. The moment Camille Dorsey knew the system would do exactly what it always did: protect the wrong person while watching the right one burn. And that, finally, was her trigger. Not Braddock's insults, not the judge's silence, but the collective inaction of a room that should have known better. So she reached slowly into her pocket. No dramatics, no fanfare, just an old black flip phone, no thumbprint, no facial recognition, just numbers. She opened it quietly beneath the table, her hand calm and steady, and typed 3 letters: initiate. Then she pressed send. To anyone watching, it looked like she was checking a message, maybe a calendar, maybe a note. But across the city, deep in a secure government server buried beneath layers of digital silence, a protocol activated. A private channel opened. Audio and video began streaming in real time to the Office of Legal Oversight, encrypted and backed by 3 redundant servers. The courtroom, for the first time in its life, was no longer in control of its own walls. Camille closed the flip phone and placed it gently on the table beside her notes. Nothing about her face changed. Nothing about her voice rose. But inside, something had locked into place. Braddock was still grinning, still proud of himself. Judge Lasker finally mumbled, "Let's not get dramatic. Miss Dorsey, do you have anything further for this witness?" Camille stood. Her voice was calm, her spine unshaken. "No, Your Honor, not at this time." But something had shifted. Again. And this time, the room felt it more deeply. It wasn't just that Camille had countered Braddock's noise with silence. It was that she no longer looked like someone trying to prove anything. She looked like someone who already knew how the story would end. And then, without warning, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 2 men in charcoal gray suits entered, tall, still, composed. No badges visible, no introductions. They walked slowly down the center aisle and took positions along the back wall. Arms folded, eyes forward. No one knew who they were, but everyone knew. Judge Lasker's eyes darted toward them. The clerk leaned toward the judge and whispered something quickly. Braddock's smile vanished. "Who the hell are they?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for only Camille to hear. She didn't turn. She didn't blink. She just replied quietly, "They're here to observe justice." And they were. The federal observers weren't here for the drama. They weren't there to intervene. Not yet. They were there to watch, to record, and to report. To hold accountable a courtroom that had grown too used to its own silence. Braddock sat down, suddenly smaller in his chair. Judge Lasker cleared his throat again, this time louder, but the room didn't listen to him anymore. It listened to her. Camille turned back to the bench, unshaken. "I'd like to resume," she said. "We were in the middle of reviewing inconsistencies in Officer Braddock's written report." No one objected. The court reporter's fingers moved again, faster now. The jurors looked like they were watching a story unfold, one far bigger than the trial they'd been called for. The air felt tighter, like the walls were drawing in, not to trap Camille, but to hold everything else accountable. And behind her, standing firm like shadows with purpose, the 2 men in suits did not move. Because something more powerful than a badge or a robe had entered the room. Accountability. And it came quietly, but it came to stay. The silence that followed the arrival of the 2 men in gray suits was thick enough to feel. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But their presence clamped down on the room like a sealed vault. No one in the courtroom knew exactly who they were, but everyone understood what they represented. Oversight, accountability, eyes that couldn't be bought, and ears that would not forget. Camille Dorsey didn't need to introduce them. She had already set the stage. Now she was ready to pull the curtain back. She turned toward the evidence table, her movements as measured and graceful as ever, and withdrew a small USB drive from the inside pocket of her leather folder. She didn't hold it up like a trophy. She didn't declare its contents with flourish. She simply walked forward and plugged it into the courtroom's media station. The screen behind the judge blinked to life. Blue, then black. "I'd like to present video footage from the officer's body cam," Camille said evenly, facing Judge Lasker. "Time-stamped the morning of the arrest." Judge Lasker gave the faintest nod, his gaze darting toward the back of the courtroom again, where the observers remained still as shadows. The clerk pressed a button. The screen shifted. Play. A dashboard, a parked car, rain on the windshield. Then, clear as daylight, Devin Ellis, 22 years old, hands on the wheel, license already in his fingers. His voice, respectful. Quiet. "Officer, may I ask what I did wrong?" "Off camera?" Braddock's voice snapped back. "Step out of the vehicle!" No explanation, no warning. Just the sound of the door being yanked open. Devin's confused reply. "Wait, what?" And then the violent jolt of the body cam as Devin was pulled from the car, slammed against the hood, and handcuffed in the pouring rain. There was no resistance, no raised voice, no threat, just power, unchecked. The video ended. The screen went black. No one moved. Camille turned slowly toward Braddock, who now sat at the witness stand, shoulders tight, jaw stiff. He had stopped making eye contact 10 minutes ago. "Officer Braddock," Camille began, her voice steady as steel, "is this footage consistent with the written report you submitted to the court?" Braddock cleared his throat. "There's context." He wasn't following. "Context?" Camille asked, her brow raised. "The footage shows Mr. Ellis speaking calmly, complying fully, and receiving no explanation for the stop or arrest. You claimed he was belligerent, that he resisted." Braddock hesitated. "He had a tone." Camille let that hang in the air. A tone. She stepped closer. Not looming, not aggressive, just present and pointed. "Please read aloud the portion of your report that states Mr. Ellis reached for anything, raised his voice, or physically resisted." Braddock shuffled through his file, stalling. Pages flipped. The court waited. Camille waited. I phrased it as non-compliant demeanor." Camille turned to the judge. "Your Honor, is non-compliant demeanor recognized legal cause for physical restraint under Virginia Statute 12B?" Judge Lasker looked down at the bench. "It is not." Camille turned back. "Then, by your own report, officer, you used force where none was legally justified." Braddock shifted in his seat. He looked suspicious. "Suspicious," Camille said softly, while sitting in a parked car with both hands visible and his license already in view. She didn't shout. She didn't break stride. She simply opened another folder. This is the dispatch transcript. No reports of matching suspects in the area. No outstanding warrants. And this, she held up another page, is the jail check-in log. Mr. Ellis was processed at 11:38 a.m. The arrest occurred at 9:12, a 2-hour delay. Care to explain? Braddock rubbed his jaw again. There were technical issues. Camille tilted her head, voice still calm. And yet internal timestamps show no interruption in system functionality. The courtroom was a graveyard now. Every juror's eyes were locked on Braddock. Judge Lasker shifted uncomfortably. And the two observers at the back? Unmoving, still watching, recording. Camille wasn't finished. Let's return to the audio. Officer Braddock, did you inform Mr. Ellis of his rights during the arrest? Braddock paused. You mean in the car? Yes, or at any point before detainment. Braddock looked to the judge, looked away. It must have been off camera. Camille stepped closer, each word sharper than the last. In your report, you stated you read him his rights at the scene. Braddock didn't answer. Camille placed her hand lightly on the desk, voice dropping to something just above a whisper. Did you lie, officer? Braddock's mouth opened, then closed. From the gallery, Miss Gloria exhaled softly. That's the Dorsey fire. And there it was. The shift, again. Because this wasn't just about evidence anymore. It wasn't about legal precision or technicalities. This was about watching a woman, dismissed, disrespected, underestimated, cut through the system like a scalpel through old scar tissue. Not with rage, not with volume, with truth. Camille stepped back and faced the bench. Your Honor, the defense submits the footage, the transcript, and the check-in log as evidence of procedural misconduct and falsification of official documents. Perjury, by legal standard. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply returned to her seat, placed her folder down, and waited. Braddock didn't speak again, not because he was silenced, but because there was nothing left to say. The courtroom didn't cheer. There was no applause, but the silence had changed. It was no longer dismissive. It was reverent, respectful, heavy with the knowledge that something had just broken open. Judge Lasker stared at the documents before him, as if they were glowing. And the two federal observers? Still recording, still watching, still waiting. But now, they weren't just watching a case. They were watching a legacy step into the light. The silence after Camille Dorsey's cross-examination was not just heavy, it was generational. The kind of silence that doesn't come from shock, but from recognition. Not just of her brilliance, not just of Braddock's crumbling lies, but of something deeper, something older. It clung to the walls of the courtroom like dust stirred after too many years of stillness. People weren't just watching a lawyer dismantle a case anymore. They were witnessing history re-enter a room that had long tried to forget. In the back corner, leaning on her broom with hands that had wiped more courtroom benches than verdicts could count, Miss Gloria Fields stopped pretending to sweep. She stared across the courtroom, her eyes fixed on Camille. Not in shock, not in surprise, but in memory. She had been there before. Not just in that courthouse, in that moment. Gloria's lips parted. The words slipped out soft, raspy, like a ghost remembering its name. That's Harold Dorsey's daughter. The reporter in the second row glanced up. A few heads turned. The judge stiffened, but Camille didn't react. Not yet. She kept her gaze forward, her hand steady on the table. Because she'd known this moment was coming since the day she stepped back into this courtroom. 15 years ago, she'd sat quietly on the back bench. Same courtroom, same judge. 17 years old. Too proud to cry, too scared to speak. Her father, Harold Dorsey, had stood at that very defense table, wearing a threadbare suit, and the hope that law could still mean something in this state. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't have to. His words were steady, measured, much like hers now. But that didn't save him. Camille could still hear the echo of Judge Byron Lasker's gavel slamming down, sharp and arrogant. I won't tolerate this tone in my courtroom. All Harold had said was, "The Constitution applies equally." That was enough. A whisper in a storm of egos. Lasker called him combative, held him in contempt. Two white bailiffs had dragged Harold out of the courtroom like a trespasser instead of a defender of justice. Case files still in his hands, his tie loosened, his dignity stolen. Camille had watched him disappear through those doors. No one stood up. No one said a word. Not even Gloria, who was younger then, still a court clerk, not a janitor. She'd looked away that day. The shame had stayed with her. And now she was standing. "I was there," Gloria said, loud enough now for the courtroom to hear, her voice trembling with age and memory. I watched them humiliate that man, and I never had the courage to speak up. The room turned toward her, stunned into stillness. Gloria's eyes stayed locked on Camille. Your father, he was brilliant, gentle. He believed in this system more than it deserved, and they broke him for it. Camille stood slowly, not dramatic, not forced, just a quiet rising that carried more gravity than any outburst ever could. I don't blame you, she said softly, her voice not rising but echoing. Silence was safer back then. Then she turned toward Judge Lasker. But I'm not 17 anymore, and silence is no longer an option. The judge's face tightened. He adjusted his glasses, as if needing them to blur the memory now staring back at him in living color. Camille walked to the evidence table and laid down a faded manila folder. She opened it, one page at a time. Transcripts, appeals, rejected motions. The paper yellowed, the ink slightly faded, but the names were clear. At the bottom of every document, Judge Byron Lasker's signature. My father was disbarred for contempt, she said, holding up one document for the record. Not for misconduct, not for breaking the law, but for speaking a truth this court didn't want to hear. Lasker swallowed hard. Every motion denied, every appeal buried. You signed off on all of it. A murmur rippled through the gallery. His only crime, Camille continued, was believing that black voices belonged at the same table as yours. She wasn't crying. Her voice didn't shake. But the weight in the room grew heavier with every word. She was no longer just defending Devin Ellis. She was excavating a wound this courtroom had paved over long ago. She stepped forward again, her presence filling the space with something stronger than anger. Clarity. I came back to this courtroom today not just to defend my client, but to finish what my father started. To make sure the silence you all gave him wouldn't be the last thing this room remembered. Lasker's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He looked old now. Not in age, in guilt. Camille turned to the gallery. Everyone saw it that day, she said, and everyone looked away. But not anymore. She returned to her seat. No applause, no gavel, just stillness. Even Braddock, sitting stone-faced at the prosecution table, didn't speak. Because now, he wasn't just on trial for his lies. He was part of a chain, a system, a legacy that had finally been named out loud. Miss Gloria walked slowly toward Camille's table, the broom still in her hand. She placed one trembling palm on the wooden surface. Your daddy would be proud, child, she said through tears. Camille looked at her. I hope he'd say the same about what comes next. And with that, the courtroom understood. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. It wasn't even just about Devin Ellis. It was about a legacy once buried, and the daughter who came back to dig it out with fire in her hands and her father's voice in her spine. The weight of Harold Dorsey's memory still hung in the air, thick as thunderclouds. Camille had placed his legacy squarely at the center of the courtroom, and no one, not the jurors, not the gallery, not even Judge Byron Lasker, could pretend they hadn't seen it. For the first time in years, this room wasn't just a stage for verdicts. It had become what it always claimed to be, a place of reckoning. Camille Dorsey didn't sit back down. Not yet. She remained standing, calm and composed, her hand resting gently on the manila folder holding her father's disbarment records. But her eyes, sharp, unwavering, had shifted their focus. She was no longer just a defense attorney fighting for Devin Ellis. She was something else entirely. I believe the court has a right to know, she said, voice clear but measured, who I am, not just in name, but in office. Braddock leaned forward in confusion. Judge Lasker froze. The clerk paused mid-keystroke. Camille reached into her case file. Not rushed, not theatrical. She pulled out a black leather badge wallet and opened it slowly, deliberately, letting the gold seal catch the overhead lights. The courtroom seemed to inhale all at once. The words on the badge were impossible to misread. State of Virginia. Office of the Attorney General. Gasps broke across the gallery like glass shattering. Braddock flinched. His voice cracked before it fully formed. "You're the AG?" Camille didn't blink. "Yes." "You? Why didn't you say anything?" "Because," she replied quietly, "masks fall faster when people think you're beneath them." She let it sit there. No rush, no apology. Judge Lasker's gavel hand trembled slightly on the bench. He looked down at the seal on her badge like it was burning his eyes. "Miss Dorsey?" he started. "Attorney General Dorsey," she corrected gently but firmly. Lasker cleared his throat. "If we had known—" Camille tilted her head. "You would have treated me like a human being, but only because I wore power on my sleeve." The courtroom was silent again, but not from tension. This time, it was shame. Camille turned, stepped toward the prosecution table, and opened a new folder. This one sealed with a red sticker marked Confidential DOJ Oversight Delivery. She placed it on the evidence table and turned to face the bench. "This is a formal document from my office," she said. 7 charges against Detective Sean Braddock, including perjury, falsification of reports, excessive force, obstruction of justice, and misconduct during testimony. All substantiated by video evidence, dispatch logs, and procedural violations, presented here today. Braddock stood up so quickly his chair skidded behind him. "This is a setup," he hissed. "You baited me." Camille didn't even turn to face him. "No, officer. You baited yourself. With every lie, every shove, every file you threw at someone you thought couldn't push back." Braddock's face reddened, but his words caught in his throat. Camille turned her full attention to Judge Lasker now, and for the first time, he looked smaller than the robe he wore. "My office is authorized to pursue charges and initiate internal reviews of law enforcement officers in cases of public misconduct," she said. "The presence of federal observers in this courtroom is part of that process." As if on cue, one of the 2 gray-suited men stepped forward. He didn't speak. He simply placed another folder on the judge's bench, a thick envelope marked Federal Compliance Record. Urgent. Lasker opened it with shaking hands. His face drained of color as he scanned the contents. This can't be right," he muttered. Camille took a single step closer. "It is." He looked up at her, desperation behind his glasses. "This is unprecedented." "No," she said calmly. "What's unprecedented is how long this courtroom has operated without consequence." The jurors, still stunned, leaned forward. The gallery sat motionless. Even the bailiff, the same one who'd shoved a file into her chest an hour earlier, lowered his gaze. And Braddock? He didn't move, because now, the shield of impunity he wore had cracked. The badge that once silenced others had turned into a spotlight. Camille pressed forward. "The Department of Justice will be issuing a full review of cases processed in this courtroom over the last 10 years, she said. All cases involving Officer Braddock's testimony will be reassessed. Judge Lasker opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Only the low hum of institutional collapse filled the space between them. Camille turned back to the bench one last time. "This isn't about politics, Your Honor. It's not about vengeance. It's about accountability. And the fact that it's taken this long is the true disgrace." And then she stepped back. There were no applause, no loud affirmations, just the quiet hum of justice settling into places it had avoided for far too long. The two federal agents remained at the back of the room, still watching, recording. History was no longer just being made. It was being documented. Braddock didn't resist when the bailiff approached, didn't say a word when the cuffs clicked around his wrists. He just stared at Camille, blinking like someone waking up from a dream where they thought they were invincible. "You planned all this," he whispered as he was led away. Camille met his eyes, calm, impenetrable. "No," she said. "You did. I just watched you write your own ending." Judge Lasker slumped slightly in his chair, the weight of his name now tethered to something he couldn't dismiss. Not anymore. He looked at Camille one last time. "What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. Camille didn't hesitate. "Step down," she said. He did. The robe folded, the gavel quiet. He left the bench not as a judge, but as a man who finally understood what it meant to be seen through. And Camille? She stood in the center of that courtroom like a daughter carrying more than a badge. She carried her father's voice. She carried a decade of buried injustice. And now she carried a system that had no choice but to answer her. The courtroom held its breath as the bailiff, hesitating for the briefest second, reached for the cuffs. No one moved. No one whispered. The room had shifted from theater to reckoning, and every pair of eyes now watched history unfold. Not with thunder, but with restraint. Detective Sean Braddock didn't struggle, didn't bark, didn't protest. He just stood there, stiff as concrete, his arms extended forward in slow disbelief as the cold click of steel closed around his wrists. The sound wasn't loud, but it echoed like a confession. Braddock flinched, maybe from the weight of his own humiliation, or maybe because for the first time in 12 years, the law had finally turned toward him. The bailiff looked to Judge Byron Lasker, almost like asking for permission. But there was no authority left in Lasker's silence, no protection behind that raised bench, so the bailiff simply did his job. He turned Braddock around, guided him past the rows of stunned jurors and toward the courtroom doors, past the same aisle where Braddock had strutted earlier that morning, folder in hand, drunk on dominance. Now even the floor seemed unwilling to hold his weight. Miss Gloria Fields, still standing in the back corner, broom forgotten, watched it all with glistening eyes. She didn't clap. She didn't cheer. But her lips pressed into a firm line of something like justice, aged but not forgotten. Camille Dorsey, still poised at the center of it all, didn't gloat. She didn't so much as blink as Braddock was led out of the room. That part was never her goal. His fall was a consequence, not the point, because she wasn't finished. As the courtroom's attention swiveled back toward the bench, Camille stepped forward again. Not with force, not with heat, but with the steady, cold breath of truth in her hands. She reached for a second folder, thicker than the one before, weathered at the edges. She placed it gently on the evidence table and opened it without ceremony. "This," she said, "is a collection of 23 cases spanning 9 years, presided over by Judge Byron Lasker. Each involves evidence of procedural bias, improper denial of defense motions, and violations of due process." The courtroom stilled again. Lasker visibly paled. Camille continued, voice calm and exacting. "In 13 of these cases, requests for discovery were denied without written explanation. In 6, body cam footage was omitted from the trial record. In 4, defendants were sentenced beyond state recommendation guidelines without judicial review." She placed the top page before her. "And in at least one case, People v. Harold Dorsey, a legal motion was rejected within 8 minutes of submission. No hearing, no record, no response." Lasker tried to speak. Nothing came out. Camille looked at him directly now. "Your Honor, I'm formally recommending your recusal from all pending matters involving my office, effective immediately. These findings will be submitted to the State Commission on Judicial Conduct by end of day." Lasker opened his mouth again, but there were no words. Only the sound of his breath catching as his robe, once a shield, now clung to him like a costume he no longer deserved to wear. You can defend your record in the proper venue, Camille added, but not from behind that bench. The gallery watched him, not with hatred, not with rage, with realization. The old guard wasn't falling from a push. It was crumbling from within, rotted by years of unchecked silence finally meeting its consequence. One of the jurors whispered something to another. Neither smiled. Judge Lasker placed his hands on the edge of the bench. Slowly, deliberately. He didn't slam a gavel. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, folded his robe, and stepped down. Just like that. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It breathed. A long collective exhale that had been held for years, maybe decades. The air felt different now. Not lighter, but honest. Camille turned, not to the judge's empty seat, but to the people. Justice, she said quietly, doesn't require a stage, just courage and memory. Miss Gloria nodded from the back, a tear tracking silently down her cheek. Camille didn't need applause. She didn't need headlines. She just needed the system to see itself for what it had become, and begin again. She gathered her folders, closed her binder, and walked back to the defense table as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had, because justice didn't shout. It whispered, and still shook the ground. The courtroom hadn't cheered. It hadn't erupted in applause or chants or raised fists. But what Camille Dorsey did in that room would echo louder than any headline ever could. Judge Byron Lasker stepped down. Detective Sean Braddock was led out in cuffs. And the silence Camille had carried with her, the same silence that once meant invisibility, had become a force that turned the entire system on its axis. But what happened next proved that the reckoning wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. 2 mornings later, Camille sat at her desk in Richmond, her office unusually still. The noise of the media storm swirled just outside, interviews requested, headlines printed, cameras waiting. The woman who didn't blink, one headline read. Virginia's quiet reckoning, said another. She ignored them all. Instead, she reached for the stack of envelopes that had begun to pile up. Some typed, some printed, and one in particular, handwritten in pencil. The return address read Greenville Middle School. Camille opened it carefully. Inside, on ruled notebook paper with a neat pink border, was a letter. Dear Ms. Dorsey, my name is Talia. I'm 13. I watched the whole trial with my mom. She said you didn't even yell once. But they still heard you. I didn't know we could do that. I didn't know someone like me could be strong like that. Thank you. P.S. I want to be a lawyer now. Camille read it twice. Then a third time. She placed the letter down slowly. Not because it was fragile, but because she was. For the first time in days, she let the moment wash over her. She hadn't just exposed a lie. She'd made space for belief, for change, for daughters who needed to see what justice looked like when it didn't shout to be heard. Outside her office window, crowds had formed, not in protest, but in petition. Students, teachers, community organizers, lawyers, judges, survivors of the system who'd once given up on it. They weren't holding signs. They were holding stacks of paper. Reform petitions. 27 counties. In just 48 hours. Each petition demanding judicial oversight. Body cam accountability. Retrials for past convictions presided over by Judge Lasker. And all of them, every single one, started the same way. Inspired by the Attorney General's courtroom testimony on behalf of Devin Ellis. Camille didn't smile. She nodded. Quietly. To herself. She spent the next 6 weeks not giving interviews, not standing on stages, but buried in case files. Some were 10 years old. Some were fresh from the inbox. All of them deserved light. She called them in quietly. Law students, junior attorneys, overlooked paralegals who had fire, but no mentor. She sat with them after hours, reviewing transcripts, teaching them how to see what had been missed, what had been buried. One by one, she reopened doors that had long been shut. She didn't wait for approval. She was the approval. They called it a quiet legal revolution. Camille didn't call it anything. She just kept showing up. Miss Gloria visited once a week now. Not to clean, just to sit. Sometimes she'd bring sweet tea. Sometimes Camille would be too deep in a folder to notice she'd arrived. And sometimes Miss Gloria would simply say, "Your daddy would have done it just like this." Camille would never answer, but her eyes always softened. Then came the morning, the one without fanfare. No headlines, no petitions. Just mist curling around the sidewalk like breath. Camille rose early, earlier than usual. She dressed in gray slacks, a navy coat, and a soft black scarf. No makeup, no badge on display. Just the folder and her father's name. The cemetery was quiet, deeper than silence, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath. Camille walked slowly along the path, her shoes brushing the dew from the grass. She paused at the headstone, Harold Dorsey, 1950-2008. Below the name, 4 etched words, "Justice is the long game." Camille knelt. She didn't cry. She never cried here. Instead, she reached into her coat and removed her badge. The same one that had caught the courtroom lights when she revealed who she truly was. The same one that had earned the respect her voice had never been granted until that day. She laid it gently at the base of the headstone. The gold seal caught the soft morning light. She placed her hand on it, then on the stone. "They heard you, Dad," she whispered, just loud enough for the wind to carry. "Through me." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed. Then she sat. For a long while. With the mist, with the silence, with everything her father had been forced to swallow, with everything she had finally said. Her phone buzzed once. An email. Subject line, re-petition 284, motion to reopen case, People vs. Calhoun, 2009. Camille stood, picked up her badge, but she didn't clip it back on. She just held it, then turned toward the path. Not triumphant, not victorious, just ready. Ready for what came next. Because justice hadn't finished. It had just started listening. In a world where noise often drowns out meaning, Camille Dorsey taught us that justice doesn't have to shout to be heard. Over the course of just one day in a Virginia courtroom, she unraveled lies, exposed institutional rot, and rewrote history. Not with fury, but with quiet certainty. And what began as one woman defending a young man became something far greater. A reminder to every American that power doesn't only live in titles, robes, or uniforms. Sometimes it lives in silence, backed by truth. Camille didn't break the system with noise. She cracked it open with composure, with facts, with legacy. Her story is more than inspiring. It's instructional. It teaches us that courage doesn't always look like protest. Sometimes it looks like poise under pressure. That reform doesn't always start on the steps of a Capitol building. Sometimes it begins in the way we refuse to look away when injustice enters a room. In just 24 hours, petitions flooded across 27 counties. A 13-year-old girl found her voice. A janitor reclaimed her own silence. And a daughter fulfilled a promise her father never had the chance to finish. So what do we do with a story like this? We don't just watch it. We carry it. We remember that our courtrooms belong to the people, that no robe or badge is above accountability, and that quiet resistance can still move the ground beneath us. We remember that our silence, when used with strength, can be louder than any gavel. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Let it grow. Let it move through your communities, your classrooms, your circles of influence. Let it challenge you to stand up, even if it's with stillness, like this video. Share it with someone who needs hope, clarity, or courage. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that don't just entertain, they empower. Because here at Mr. Mac Stories, we don't just tell what happened. We remind you of what's still possible. Camille Dorsey showed us that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly, lays down a badge, and whispers, "You were heard." Now it's our turn. If you're listening, raise your silence, speak with your action, and let justice rise again.